Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Gave us a good sense of the richness of your dissertation. I'm going to ask our virtual guest, Jack, if you have a question to get us started, and then we'll go to Susan and then myself, and then I'll open it up to the larger community. Professor Goldstone, do you have a question you would like to ask?
Thank you, Terrance. Yes, I have a couple of questions. One, I would go back, if we could, to one of the slides, findings number 3. This is with the information on the districts of Kampala and Jinja.
Next one. That one. There you go.
I think these are some of the most interesting and powerful findings that I saw in the dissertation, particularly if you look at the views on citizen participation to set local priorities. In Kampala, 70% of respondents called it inadequate, against only 13% in Jinja. For citizen participation to influence local elections, Kampala says 57% of respondents, not at all. They think they have no influence, whereas in Jinja, that number is only 3%. So it's almost as if you're looking at two different countries in terms of citizen participation. Now, my question is, how much of that is a function of different views of the central government, and how much of that really is the re-centralization of power within Buganda?
Thank you, Professor Jack. In Busoga is culturally organized, still culturally organized in a chieftainess system. So when local governments are elected, you know, the chieftainess system has this character of people living in a family-like environment where they are all related to one another. So when you have a chief who is senior, chances are in Busoga that the local government leader will also be, you know, either a chief or associated with that. The tendency, therefore, is not to see local governments and the chiefdom as different, because this is how the society is organized. It becomes easy then for people in Busoga to say, we influence political leadership. Why? Because the chief is the LC leader. This is very common in Busoga. And I cited in the dissertation a case where the local chief is the LC1 and his son is the LC2, and you know, and these were elected. Why? Because these are the traditional chiefs. Not necessarily a function of re-centralization, but a function of the way the culture is the community is historically organized. And therefore the perception is that the difference these are the same people. My chief is the LC1 leader, so the difference is not there. You know, which is different in Buganda, because the chiefs are only appointed by the king, and the people elect the chiefs, the local governments. So the election of a local government and the chief becomes more of a competition between the two authorities. And when people say we don't have any influence at that level, part of this is the area I explained to you that, and you are right in the case of Buganda, Professor, to say, is this a function of decentralization? Yes, because the local governments, therefore, in Uganda, and the authority and the preference, the authority and the power they have over the chiefs tend to be drawn from the state. And if they are elected on a party card, on a political party card, which is the NRM now, if it is the NRM that is also in power, they become responsible and accountable to the state as opposed to the local communities. So in Buganda, decentralization has a much more intense effect through a multi-party setting as opposed to what happens in Busoga.
Let me add a question then, if I might. Again, I think this is just wonderful, and you have really shown that decentralization functions very differently, and the traditional African problems of corruption and personal influence seem to have re-emerged despite decentralization, indeed in direct conflict with decentralization in the case of Uganda, which is quite striking. The question I'm going to ask is one that's closer to my interest than to yours, but one where maybe we can find common ground that will help you illustrate your findings. One of my concerns about the future of Uganda as a whole is that it has one of the fastest growing populations in Africa. Fertility has remained very high despite economic growth. Women have 5 to 6 children per household. Now there is a state program, the Reproductive Health Program, that is designed to try and improve women's access to family planning. But it is a program that comes from the central government and then is carried out through local governments. Given that the effectiveness of local government is so different in these regions, what advice would you give to someone who is interested in promoting family planning, and your goal is to have a strong local influence at the villages to encourage people to take advantage of this government service? Would you look to win over the traditional government, the local elected government, the chiefs, and how would your approach or your recommended approach be different in the two different regions of Busoga and Uganda?
Thank you, Professor. I would, in the context of decentralization, I would go for localization of the program. As we speak now, it is so, the reproductive health program is so centrally managed by the state. It's not localized yet. There hasn't been a broad, local, grassroots-based communal conversation on reproductive health. In the case of Busoga, I find that local governments would be very effective on their own to conduct these communal conversations, local programs on how people can participate and promote reproductive health. But in Buganda, I would encourage very strongly that traditional authorities are included in this conversation. I have that example drawing from the riots that you might have heard about when Mabida Forest was being sold by government. It was a government decision and the explanation was clear. We need development to take place, and if there is unused resources, land, we need to put it to use. But the Baganda went to the street saying that land belongs to the king. And if in Buganda, land belongs to the king, but the king holds it in trust for his people. So they are fighting for their land. They know that if the king has it, we can access it. If government sells it off, we have no access. The same would happen in this case, that once you have a program, you need to bring the local people, the local chiefs and the traditional authorities in conversation with government on how that such a program can be more effective in the region. Again, that goes to say, as decentralization produces different results, is that that program will require different approaches in different districts to become more effective. Otherwise, a uniform approach across the country may produce again different results.
Thank you, Ashad. It's a very helpful response. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you, Jack. I'll now let Susan Hirsch intervene with some of her questions.
Thanks, Ashad. Really very nice job presenting what's a really rich, really complex argument, complex engagement with multiple theoretical areas and a lot of data that you collected and that you analyzed. I think to pull out, as Jack said, some very, very strong findings. So I really appreciate the work that you've done. And I want to flag a little lineage connection. As I saw, one of your first slides come up, I just wanted to mention that Don Horowitz was on my dissertation committee. Yeah, and
so you are the grandson of Horowitz.
Absolutely. So you can trace that. It goes a little matrilineal. Yeah, so
it's all constructed.
Yeah, there you go. But that means that you'll need to go back one of your, that one. Horowitz did not write in 1885 because, he was.
You just have a typo there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You just have a typo.
So I want to go a little bit more into what explains the differences between the two findings. And I think what you just said in response to Jack's question really lays out in some nice detail the different political structures associated with each kingdom and how those meet up with the decentralization process. But along the way, you mentioned some other things that are different about those two communities. And I'm wondering, since your argument turns on the fact that decentralization works differently given different local areas or different characteristics of ethnic groups, I'm wondering if we have fully understood all of the characteristics that might create a difference. So I just want to ask about a couple of others. And again, I think you explained in a very nice way how the kind of political difference lines up. But I'll ask you a question I've asked you before. Is there any difference in the fact that for the Buganda, they really are a majority in the regions in which they inhabit, whereas the Busoga are in multi-ethnic regions? Does that make any difference in people's perceptions? And let me just put a couple other options out, and then you can treat them all. You mentioned land, and really how important land is for how Buganda feel about decentralization. That anything about how the government might be pulling away power. Is land somehow more important or more of a factor than for Busoga? Maybe their attachments to land are not the same. And a little bit that's a question about identity, but it's a question about material resources. And partly I ask it because it also seemed that you were indicating that Busoga are quite impoverished. And so is there a different, is it the relative resources available to each group that's also something really important about the difference that decentralization makes? So I guess boiling it down, one's a question about the resources and another's a question about the demography of what they represent in the nation.
In the case of Busoga, the control of land in Buganda largely in the hands of the state and then goes through local government. That is the same in Busoga. But the point is, how do these groups attribute that lack of control? How do they explain it? In Busoga, they explain it as a malfunctioning of the system. and I presented responses from participants to that. One chief in Busoga told me, Kakira Sugar Works, which is the biggest sugar producing factory in Kampala, in Uganda, occupies, is it 6,000, is it 6,000 square meters or something of sugar, of land that belongs to the monarch. And then he mentioned to me, but we don't get any money from use of that land.
Thank you.
He said they used to give us an equivalent of $100 as contribution for fuel towards the king's transport. And now we don't get it anymore. But they attribute that to a weakness in how these local leaders are functioning. The difference with Buganda is that Buganda attributes that allocation of prime land in Buganda and so on to the state and say this is the government doing it to us. Here they attribute it to a weakness in the local leaders they have in Busoga. That presents different targets when you are going to riot or to have a conflict. That locally in Busoga, you will have attention directed towards our local leaders are weak. While in Buganda, it is government is against us. You get it? Now, in the same way, if there is this differences in poverty, Busoga is impoverished, okay? That is not attributed to the state. Why? Because Busoga Kingdom and the people, they know that right from inception, governments have been behind, is the driving force behind the Basoga ethnic group. They were created, actually the word Busoga, the soga is a type of plant that was dominant in the region, okay? And because these were different chiefdoms, they looked for a name that unites all, and they, you know.
But is that still their perception? I mean, is that their critique of it? I know we can look back historically.
One LC3 chairman told me that Busoga has always been behind government, any government.
Behind, in support of, you mean?
In support of, because that is where they draw their strength. That is where they draw their influence. As opposed to Buganda, that has always said, we are a civilization of 400 years. This is what we have been, and this is what we would like to maintain. I agree with you to say that you find these majorities, the different ethnic groups, knowing that Buganda, although they are 18%, but in Kampala you'll find other ethnic groups in Kampala. You find, I don't know whether that's what you meant, and in Busoga, you find that there are so many other ethnic groups.
Yeah, they're almost like a third, something like that.
Yes.
So their ability to even imagine great power is fairly limited.
But again, this is what I discovered, that the tendency for people to identify with the dominant group is common in each region. And Elliot Green conducted the research on the role of population growth in ethnic conflict in the Great Lakes region. And he concluded that one of the drivers of ethnic conflict, this group sense of group entitlements and group organization, is not necessarily that you find pure Buganda there participating, but there is what they call sons of the soil. He advanced a term called sons of the soil. These are people who, in the sense of the American, the melting pot here, they are born into these regions of mother and father, not Buganda, but they speak Uganda, they practice Uganda, and so on and so forth. These are people who know that by joining the struggle for the larger group gives us a sense of belonging, and when we control land, I can always access land as opposed to if government is in charge. So there is that tendency of these sons of the soil people not necessarily being Buganda, but they come and constitute the group and join the struggle because of the benefits to present. This is also was also discovered when Mamdani was doing research in Rwanda, and in his book Citizen and Subject, he discovered that pure Hutus and pure Hutus are not there anymore. They are very difficult to find, but they maintain these identities and fight along those lines because of the benefit the identity presents, probably that the state fails to do. The same happens in northern Ghana, amongst the Andani and Abdu. There has been so much intermarriages, and between these ethnic groups, the Dagomba, the Namumba, the Konkombas, and so on, there has been so much intermarriage that for you to find clear Dagomba people, maybe, you know, I don't know that I'm correct, but I've come across that argument in northern Ghana that there has been, because this is a conflict that has gone on for over 150 years, 200, and therefore the ethnic mix in the region makes this, but it doesn't take away the distinction that people draw when threats are perceived and when conflict arises, to find who is with us and who is not.
Just on that last point, I'm wondering about how to extend your findings to other places. And do you see other African contexts where this is very relevant? And what about outside Africa? You talked about the Swedish model coming in, but is this attention to ethnicity or maybe some other aspect of locality, you're drawing attention to that as important in any decentralization process. So any other African countries where it might be useful, and how are you approaching the use of this model or these findings elsewhere?
Thank you, Professor Susan. I'm finding this to be very relevant in Kenya. In the context of the new constitution they have developed and the devolution that you know, and currently there are news reports that after the election of Kenyatta, the first thing he targeted is the constitution and undermine devolution. He's developing policies again, kind of re-centralizing the decentralization system that is. So I find this study to be applicable in Kenya. I may have to make contacts and extend in that area. But also in situations like Somalia, where decentralization has been recommended, and even in Iraq, where decentralization has been recommended, but then you have this strong clan system in Somalia that divides the north and the south and the others, and to see how the system could be applied, but responding to the unique forms of clan influence that are in the south that are not necessarily in the north. You know, despite the fact that the language is the same with Afghanistan. So I believe that the area of application of this and to test out and roll it out is quite broad, both in Africa. In Zimbabwe, there is still a need to contextualize what power sharing actually contained, although this was more in form of grand coalition, as Litchford would say, but even in the context of decentralization, because I tend to have a thinking that in Zimbabwe, the problem started in 1912, when the Shonas were attacked by this other group who broke away from Zulus in South Africa, and they went and captured their land, and when this partition of Africa came, both groups were put in the same area, and when Mugabe says Zimbabwe is mine, He doesn't say I'm the life president or whatever, but he's a Shona and he's the indigenous. The other ones are people who came through Botswana and captured land. So he's saying, I'm the indigenous person. If you were to implement decentralization in a context like that, you are likely to have different claims to the kind of power you decentralize and how it functions to meet the interests of the local people.
Thank you, Ashad. Just one quick note on that last. I think as you think of what you want to do next with this body of research and the kind of ways that you, perhaps multiple ways you may want to publish it, those last points on generalization, that you are telling a story that's of interest to beyond people who are interested in Uganda, but to people who are interested more broadly in state society, interethnic relations, and that with a little more broadening your framework, you'll be able to tell your story in a way that resonates with people who are interested in Zimbabwe or Afghanistan or Burma and lots of other places. I have two questions that I want to ask you. One is similar to one that I've asked you before, and one is kind of to take you in a new direction beyond slightly beyond your dissertation. Can you quickly go to your conclusions 2 slide? That's the one where you have your matrix, your relationship matrix with negative and non-positive and so on. I think the wording is more convoluted than it needs to be here, in that the core message that you have here, the core finding that you have here, gets lost a bit in your language. Now to say that, we can talk about it in more concrete ways, because I don't want to sort of wordsmith as we're sitting around the table. What I really want you to get at a more conceptual point is in this framework and in other places in the dissertation, you make a distinction between what you call, where's an example of it? It's the difference between service delivery and cultural and identity interests. So you have, for example, relationships are non-positive when devolution is perceived to function to deliver services, in contrast to ethnic groups perceive their cultural and identity interests over power and resources threatened. And I'm wondering if that's the best way to distinguish or to differentiate, as you have in this 2x2 table, because the identity interests that they're talking about are not the identity of cultural practices. It's cultural interest in land, cultural interest in the ability to tax land, cultural interest in material goods. It's not about, will you allow us to practice our culture, but you give us our land back. You pay us the rent you owe us for the land you took from us. And so it seems to me that the kind of service versus culture, or service delivery as a kind of a material, are you getting good roads, are you getting good schools kind of thing, in contrast to an identity, doesn't quite capture it, because the Buganda cultural interest is an interest to control what they make claims as their land, right? And so it's in many senses, it's a struggle not over identity, but it's a struggle over land and resources. And that then makes this distinction you're making here, to me, not quite as sharp, or it doesn't follow your story quite as accurately as it might. But we've gone back and forth on this before, so I just want to give you a chance to...
yes, that is the challenge that decentralization is facing. And that is the very scenario that it has to mediate to manage the conflict in the region. Is that how does local government that is mandated to control land according to the constitution,
that the Bugandans do not accept.
That the Bugandans do not accept,
right?
Okay, the control of land, right. And they are saying we need to control this.
Good.
But the system continues, good. Endures, and local governments are there. How do you create the space for that conversation to occur? To make sure that control of land continues to be regulated, as the state would do responsibly, but in ways that do not pose threat to the Buganda. For instance, if you bought a plot of land now in Buganda, they would need a letter from the local council before they give you the land title. But local chiefs appointed by the king at these levels, there is also an office of, which I put in the dissertation to manage land in Buganda. When you present this letter from local government to office to the Minister of Lands, they would ask you, have you worked out that?
Have you talked to the chief?
Have you talked to the chief? If you go to the chief and you say, I need land, I'm going to lease this land, they will say, have you talked to the, to the LC?
Right.
But the local government statute and the mandate does not have that provision. But the authorities know, the people know in Buganda that you are LC, you are chief, and you need authorization from both. But the policy does not state that, doesn't have that provision. Okay? Reimagining occurs when that conversation takes place, when the mandate is expanded to allow that conversation to take place, and that interaction on managing land, so that more from Buganda's side, it is more about recognition. It's not that they would be against building a flat or a residential area you want, but it is more about recognition, but also comes with money.
Yeah, that's my point.
You know,
you
land.
can call it, this is Buganda land, but I'm paying the government.
But
But I'm
I'm
saying,
paying-
no, pay me, because it's my land.
So that is the challenge that I'm pointing to actually. But in cases where there is a delivery of that service, the local governments are working well, okay, and the structures are in place and they are managing the land, but you have not contacted the Buganda Land Board to get authorization. Buganda Land Board would say, what is happening with these local government service providers? They are doing things without our consent. So the system is working well, but the threat persists in terms of, due to the absence of consultation, and it's a matter of reviewing the mandate that you give local governments to allow these other players to be part of the decision-making process on developing the land. This is where I say that the system would function well, but the threat persists if that doesn't take place. The same with provision of problem solving. If people have argued of have a problem loaning money and cows and so many other things, they would go to local governments, and once a decision is reached, they know it will be enforced because they speak to the police and so on. But that doesn't take away, 70% said they go to local governments, but it doesn't take away the perception, that the state is dividing up Buganda to weaken the monarchy from 13 districts to 36 in a very short time. They are creating small political units within us to increase the control of the state and weaken the coherence of the Baganda, which is the monarchy. The word Buganda comes from the word Ganda, which means bundles that are supposed to be together. And once you divide them territorially into smaller political units, the monarchy is arguing that is dividing up the Baganda and to weaken the monarchy. So, but the system is working well, as you may see. It has been implemented for 20 years, and decisions that, but the Bagandas feel threatened by the creation of the new districts. This is exactly what we have been talking. We may need to reimagine the system to become as responsive to culture and identity interests, as opposed to
One more way on this. I don't want to solve this here because I think it's a rich conversation. But the phrase that you put it, cultural and identity interest over power and resources. Now, if you just want me to say the ethnic groups perceive conflicts over power and resources, well, then I get it. I don't know why you need to do a social identity theory and put it in terms of culture when it's a land fight. It's a fight over who controls land and resources. But you want to use the cultural language and cultural theories and identity theories to understand that rather than seeing it as a conflict over power and resources and interests. So it's a different way of looking at it, and I don't need you to solve that right now. But that's, to me, the phrase cultural and identity interest. You have to put the next part there. It's over power and land. That's what the cultural and identity interests are about. But let me leave that there, because, and take you a little bit beyond your dissertation. But goes to another differentiation you make in this dissertation, and that is between the kind of formal politics of local councils versus the kind of traditional politics of chiefs, right? What about a third way of understanding politics in a country like Uganda, which is to say neither of those is what's really going on here. It's really about neo-patrimonial networks. It's about Museveni's son linking up with military people and guys who have control over oil. That's what's really running Uganda. The rest of this, whether it's the formal councils or the local chiefs, they don't have the real money. They're not the real decision makers. That's not where power lies. Power lies, as it often does in Africa and other parts of the world, in informal patronage networks, rather than by either the formal chieftains, the traditional chieftains, or the local government, right?
I drew my understanding of power from what the theories claim, and not what Museveni was doing.
What his son is doing.
Or what his son is doing. I drew my understanding and definition of power and understanding of it and how it is exercised in the context of Horowitz and Litchford, and the claim that once it is shared. Now, the version you are suggesting is also true, and I cited in the dissertation a former prime minister from Buganda Kingdom who said openly in the papers that we were told that decentralization would respond to the demands of a federal system for Buganda. The system turned out to create jobs for NRM people. Now, part of creating jobs is the favoritism and nepotism I talked about, but also entrenching the system that is otherwise controlled by only the president. And now the son seems to be taking over. So you are right to look at it from that perspective, Professor. You are right to say that is, especially since, as I've told you, that the system evolved synonymous with the movement. Right. So they believe that the difference more or less is not there. And as I say in the dissertation, it fails when these local governments are perceived as party structures of the NRM, as opposed to being locally elected governments to serve local people. That is where the system fails, that they are perceived as local structures. Now, if they are local structures that are funded by the NRM government, then that is an extension of Museveni's rule to the grassroots, and that is how it influences people. But you are very right to look at it that way. I agree.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jack, do you have anything else, or I'm going to turn it over to the audience here to ask a few questions, unless you have something?
The two things I would note are to reinforce one thing that you said on generalization, being able to tell the story of decentralization and its differential effects in multiple contexts, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Iraq, will be terrifically useful in helping Ashad publish the work, and indeed, I think there are multiple publications. One's focusing on Uganda for Africa specialists, and then one's focusing on the decentralization issues for journals looking at ethnic studies, democracy, and so on. So that was very helpful. Second comment is the debate you just had. While I think it may be useful for Ashad to think about what are the material interests behind this, I wouldn't push quite so hard. I think you may be talking past each other a bit. In a sense, the material interests and conflicts are the theater in which the power conflicts are played out. So a dispute over king's control of land or village control of land is just one way of showing the uncertainty over who really has control here. Do we have control as a people? Is the central government exercising control? Do our traditional leaders have control? So I think it could be any resource. As Ashad said, it could be a new industrial installation, it could be a power plant, it could be agricultural land, but anything that's a bone of contention will illustrate the power relationships.
That's well put. Thank you.
I think that's right. That's a more macro way of thinking about it rather than the way I was.
Yeah, but it still leaves on the table the cultural identity wording.
Whether it's about identity or about power. I mean, basically it's about...
Yeah, Jack's just kind of made that frame on that side of it a bit wider.
Yeah, good. Any questions from colleagues in the audience? Mari?
So I sort of missed about, I think, 10 minutes of your presentation. So I was wondering, you're talking about decentralization. You talked about Uganda as such, like a kingdom. So my question is, how centralized? Because the existence of kingdom by itself is sort of undemocratic. It's a very interesting thing, because like now you have the emergence of, okay, so the international community is saying, okay, we want democracy, we want a federal system for all this, like real problems that are out there, real problems. But okay, so my question is, what are the challenges of these entities that are sort of historically rooted before colonialism, who are now claiming, we want a federal system, but while in fact they're quite tyrant, because our system is they're very centralized, because they're trying to compete with the state. So I saw the parallel sort of system that you have out there, but does it not present a
whether they are tyrant or not, that's for you to judge. I'm not as judgmental as that. But what I know is that these are forms of authority that endure. And how do you get to reinforce the state commission process or implementing such programs? And when they come into disagreement with the state, what occurs? You have talked about Iraq and or Afghanistan. I came across an experience where the US constructed, they went to a village in Helmand and found that women were walking 5 kilometers to collect water. And they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring pipe water to the village. And the women refused to go to collect water at the tap, and they continued traveling 5 kilometers. Part of that is because that was given the culture in the area, the women are so controlled in their houses, and that was the only time they get to interface, chat and interact and make friends. Once they come back to the water, it's in the house. Now, in such a situation, you may say tribal rule is oppressive, but that's what they have. How do you get them to participate in a program that develops a region and brings water? the same applies in the context of decentralization here in Uganda, is that the kingdom is how the people are organized. And you are talking about a kingdom that claims to have contributed enormously to creating what Uganda is actually. They have so many claims. What Professor Susan asked earlier is what are those other characteristics that explain this? You know, it's not only that they Buganda claims that they actually negotiated Uganda's independence, and it was not Obote as he claims. And Buganda, when the people who came to hand over to give Buganda its independence on the 9th of October, they first went to Buganda Kingdom headquarters and handed the flag to the King of Buganda. So there is this story that Buganda became independent before Uganda did. And then, so what you are saying is,
a king who's able just to appoint his own chiefs, his own leaders. I mean, that's I think very interesting. I mean, like you claim legitimacy based on this is what I am, but then here you are, you're just picking chiefs. Oh, this is my chief, this is my chief, and that's a lot of. I don't know. That's a very centralized system.
It is centralized actually, but I mean, every regime can claim a level. Professor Andrea mentioned this to me one day, much earlier when I was thinking about this, and he said every regime can claim a level of decentralization and centralization. Okay?
Claim decentralization.
Any form of leadership can claim that. What we are focusing on under this study are how this, once any decentralization takes place there, how does it function? We are not claiming that centralization doesn't exist. It does in different forms, but when the system is adapted to decentralized state power, okay, how does that function in its own self to manage conflicts?
Now mine is more a comment, and it goes in line with the questions you're raising. Thank you very much, because I'm also struggling with these issues. You know, it's what we call today the dilemma of African constitutionalism. Who is the sovereign power in the state when you have two powers? And I'm sure if they put the king of Buganda and they put the president and ask you to slap one of them, you're not going to hesitate in slapping the president. So this tells you where the allegiance lies.
I'm not sure about that. The president will put you
He's a
in.
good guy.
Well,
He always has a gun.
so that is the first.
As you continue, he's right. In Uganda, there was a time the president wanted to visit a market where there was a crisis. And he said, I'm going to come tomorrow to speak to them. The same day, the king of Uganda was visiting another part of town. Museveni postponed it because there was going to be nobody there. They all moved where the king is. They woke up in the morning, 5, and they started sweeping these roads, and they brought mats and shirts, and the king is coming here. You know, he can't step on the ground. He's going to walk. They took off their shirts, and Museveni could not stand on one side of the city addressing people, and the king is, you know, and he postponed it. So the choice is always the king. Go ahead.
Yeah, at the level of sovereignty, you know, in Uganda there seems to be this strong connection. But you also have other areas where there isn't that much connection to the king, or where the chieftaincy was created by the colonial powers. So we have to deal with this. I'm looking more in terms of the way forward and how do we handle this in the 21st century. The second aspect is land as identity and land as a commodity. How do we deal with that? You know, because one of the problems the chiefs are going to face is that people are going to wake up and discover that the chief has sold all the land. What happens? It's another challenge, an area of conflict that we have to look at. And then the third element links to who really has the power and what is the role of the chief today. And I think we also have to look at the issue of your being a chief, the power of your chieftaincy is dependent on the quality of your being as a person and as a leader. So I think these are the three areas. Because listening to you, I wish I could just share your degree, because basically these are the issues I'm also struggling with. But thank you for raising them. You know, how do you deal with a decentralized local governance system within the context of a constitution that acknowledges two sovereign powers? And I think this is a big challenge.
Do you want to, are there a couple of more comments?
I apologize for being late, and my comments are more on your comments and conversation that preceded the final product. But one of the invitation that I felt in your work was around this issue of decentralization. Because to me, when I remember those conversations, was almost this discovery of saying, it's very clear that it's good to frame this in the context of state formation. States are never already formed, monolithic, and done. They are always forming. They are always changing. There is a plasticity to the state formation that I think people are becoming much more aware of. That there is a changing that needs to be a change that needs to be addressed. But in this particular relational element, reading this metric that you offer, I wonder if the decentralization is capturing properly the dynamics, because in many ways decentralization assumes central power and the devolution of power to someone else. While what I'm hearing and what I heard all along is that there is a power that is actually precedes the states, and that the states must recognize as already existing before the state is even formed. And that, if I understand correctly the logic, you would say the state would be stronger if they were to recognize these already existing patterns, these enduring structures of authority. And therefore, we could speak probably of something like pluricentralization or multi-centralization or mutual centralization, in which you have a mutual recognition process in which you say, well, you do some functions, I do some other functions, and we work together, and this is really not a devolution of power from the central to the periphery, if you want to use a space metaphor, but rather a recognition that no, power is already there, it's already, and by acknowledging, actually, I'm acquiring knowledge as a newly formed state, coming, and in a way it could be interesting also to frame it as a post-colonial logic, because the idea that why was the Buganda king so happy to receive the flag from the British? It's because in many ways the colonial experience is formative of Uganda as a state and Buganda as a country, as a kingdom. So there is an interesting interplay of this recognition of where the power lies, in such a way that you could say, in order for the state to be really effective in a post-colonial, post-national, post-environment, you really need to think in these pluricentric modal structures in which people are giving power to each other, the state is going to exist, you will have an army, you will have a unified representation of foreign policy, but at the same time you have these other structures that are enduring and are not just a leftover of history. They can become a fundamental component of this new emerging state that could be more effective than it is today. So just suggest in terms of playing when you do the publication, the articles and so on, to play with this a little bit further.
I think that's an excellent addition, Professor. Thank you, and I'd say consistent with one of the ideas Professor Terrance shared with me in terms of how people do perceive power, whether perceive power as limited, constrained, and if you give some to the king, then all the traditional, then you are losing so much. Or a different way of losing power, that you are suggesting that power is flexible and can accommodate people and can share, cooperate and collaborate. And these are the perceptions, and that is exactly what the professor shared. And that is what I'm suggesting, with reimagining the system and expanding the mandate of local governments to create space for interactions with these alternative forms of authority. Part of that is making power and state and these local governments more flexible to see that there is collaboration and mutual gain in building the state. Thank you so much.
I think the last question or comment.
Congratulations. I remember our early conversations about this, and to just sort of add to some of the comments that others are discussing here, when you become Prime Minister or President,
Not
I do
Kate.
see you doing.
It's not going to be Kabaka.
I know you're working on your book now, but when you become president and you're thinking about reimagining one of these things, what stood out for me in your presentation was about the nature of your questions, about where do people go. And what this shows is that it's, and to reference your question about democracy, yes, we're talking about states, yes, we're talking about previous systems, yes, we're talking about histories and sources of power and control, but we also have to remember that there's a voice of the people, and that you've described how the people are rioting, but they're choosing who they riot against. And what we're looking at here is that there are choices. People are making decisions about who they are choosing to legitimize. Which system do they go to in order to have particular kinds of structures and mechanisms in place?
And when do they use it?
And when do they use it? And so, as part of your reimagining, my question is what is the voice and role of that choice of the people in terms of access to control, as Dr. Goldstone has excellently pointed out, and in terms of what kind of future does Uganda want in terms of how they're going to function, in terms of protecting their cultural identity and having legitimacy and enforcing legitimacy to maintain their identities, as well as being able to have, as Clement noted, the control over commodity as well as identity. So, where do you imagine the voice of the people?
I think, did you say I should answer that when I become president? I think part of what we are suggesting here is to find a much more inclusive system that has space for that voice to inform it. And regardless of whether the voice reflects some historical primordial, but the space has to be there for this conversation to take place. It's a difficult conversation, but it has to take place to overcome this. We, as Clement just mentioned, would want governments and states to move to, if it is there, complete modernity in a sense, you know. But these things keep coming up. And part of what is creating this in Uganda is this frustration with the state. Once they feel the system has been in power for 20, it's coming to 30 years now, it's so congested and frustrated. The tendency for people to fall back on identity and culture, to claim control of land, increases because the system and the state is so frustrating and congested. This is why in Uganda now, traditional institutions are becoming very strong political units because the state, and they are not led by the old kings that you know. The king of in Teso, Emile More, is a former diplomat. In Buganda Kingdom, the Queen is a former World Bank advisor. The Attorney General is a Harvard graduate. The of the Buganda Kingdom, the Prime Minister is an engineer. Now they just put another one who is an accomplished lawyer. In Rwenzururu, the king has a green card. He was here for so many years. In Busoga Kingdom, the kings that are, they are all university. So you are looking at elites that are frustrated with the state and they are falling back onto these institutions. The earlier you create space within the processes of managing the state for them to have a conversation, the better. Otherwise, if you keep congesting and frustrating them, they fall back on identity and it becomes, you know, the mobilizing force to resist this thing. That's why the riots in Buganda are becoming increasingly violent every time they occur. Because the leaders are using modern skills and tools to mobilize. You know, when CBS radio station was closed during the Kayunga riots, when they in 2 months there were 8 internet radio stations, Uganda radio stations, and people were listening to Buganda radios on the internet, which government had no control over. You want to know the names? One of them is called Dictator Museveni Must Go.com. You go on the internet and put Dictator Museveni Must Go.com. You will hear Buganda mobilizing, and so that what I'm
radio station.
you know. So what I'm saying is part of this conversation and this dissertation is to allow the space to the state to be more responsive to local needs and interests and avoid that kind of mobilization. Thank you.
I'm going to say thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. And the geography. Congratulate you very much, Dr. Ashad Sentongo. The only questions we have are what you need to do to make this into a wonderful book.
Nice job.
And as a dissertation, it's a top-notch piece of work. Thank you.